Okay, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. And so there is some so my name's Fatima Raja because I didn't introduce myself 2 seconds ago. And so, like I said, this 5 bull stream is going to be about the Cold War. And so there is some debate about like what periods, what years the Cold War lasted from, but we'll be talking about 1945, so the end of World War II, to 1965. And so that covers like a couple of decades, right? And so, but in this stream, we'll be talking about the causes of the Cold War, some of like the major events that happened, and like some of the specific characteristics that define the Cold War period, and then ultimately what ended the Cold War. So like what caused the Cold War to like come to a close. And so some background about the Cold War is that like I said a few minutes ago, there is some debate over like what years it lasted from. So some people say it lasted until like 1965. Other historians say that it lasted until 1980. But it's universally agreed that the Cold War was a conflict between the Soviet Union, or like the USSR, and the United States. And so it included their Eastern and Western allies, like respectively. And so the reason why it's called the Cold War, which some of you guys may know, is because there wasn't any direct large-scale conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So even though like both countries like got involved in like other areas like the Vietnam War or like wars in Afghanistan, there wasn't a point in time where the Soviet Union and the United States like went to war directly. So like US troops were never like in the Soviet Union, and like the Soviet Union troops were never like in the United States. So even though there were times where like their respective allies were fighting, it was never like those two specific countries fighting directly. And that's why it was called a Cold War, because a hot war would have been like where there was actually conflict, and so where there were actually like troops in battle. And so the Cold War was about essentially differences in ideology. So the US was advocating for capitalism and a free market and like ideals of democracy, right? And so, on the other hand, the Soviet Union after World War II was advocating for communism. And so that was kind of like the idea that the government should like be the central planner. It should be able to like control aspects of society. And so in like communist systems, there's less of a focus on the free market, and the government does more like central planning. So like a lot of essential industries are controlled by the government. And so one of the like main causes of like the Cold War was the fact that the Soviet Union had installed many like left-wing governments and was like supporting many like communist-like regimes in Eastern European countries. And so America was fearful that this like influence that the Soviet Union had over like Eastern European countries would spread to the rest of Europe, and that the USSR would get way more influence than America was comfortable with, right? And so because America after World War II was considered to be a superpower, it wanted to like use its newfound status in order to like prevent the Soviet Union from gaining that influence in the long term. And so that's like part of the reason why like the Cold War happened. And so as like World War II ended, like in 1945, the Soviets army had occupied some of those like Eastern European countries that Germany had conquered, right? And so this is when the Truman Doctrine came into play. So the United States, and specifically President Truman, said that the United States would defend any countries that were like becoming subject to communism. And so the US pledged that it would fight communism worldwide. And so it clearly did not want communism to like spread, right? The United States wanted capitalism and democracy to be like the dominating ideologies throughout the world, because it would also mean that the United States had, like, by extension, more influence over these countries. Uh, and so it would be able to, like, have these allies all over the world. And so the United States wanted to make sure that the USSR didn't, like, convert these countries to communism first. And so this would be a good time to mention that if you guys have any, like, specific questions, just drop them in the chat, or, like, ask them by clicking the Ask a Question button. Because, yeah, the Cold War, it wasn't messy because there was a lot of fighting, but it can be a little bit complicated. So, so Jameson asks, could the Vietnam War be considered a Cold War conflict? And the answer to that question is yes. And so we'll talk about the Vietnam War specifically a little bit later. But the Vietnam War, yeah, it's widely considered to be a Cold War conflict. And so the United States, like, this is a parallel to the Monroe Doctrine. Like in 1923, the Monroe Doctrine, the United States said that it didn't want European countries, like, interfering with what was happening in, like, America's part of the globe, right? So that meant, like, the United States would deal with stuff that was happening in Latin America and Central and South America. And so it was like Europe should just stay out of it because it was, like, none of its business. And so that's kind of what's happening with, like, the Truman Doctrine, because the United States is saying that it'll support countries that are, like, democratic and support capitalism. And so ultimately, the American goal was to stop communism from, like, spreading any further than it already had. And so that was its strategy, containment. American officials were really focused on making sure that communism was not spreading any further. And specifically, they were focused on Europe, because that was where, like, the Soviet Union had already established, like, a bunch of, like, satellite communist countries. And so the USSR had become, like, fairly large. And so Perla says, I thought Monroe Doctrine was isolationist and Truman's doctrine wasn't, though. So yeah, there were some, like, major differences between those, like, two ideologies, but one similarity between them was that the United States was saying that it would be, like, more involved on the world stage, right? Because the Monroe Doctrine was essentially saying that the United States would be able to, like, oppose European colonialism in the Americas. And so if any, like, countries from Europe, like Spain or, like, England, would try to, like, further colonize South America or Latin America, the United States would, like, try to stop them. So, like, both of those doctrines were part of the United States, like, becoming more involved globally. And so, yeah, that's, like, kind of the difference between those two. And so that's when the United States decided to institute the Marshall Plan, because after World War II, Europe was suffering, like, a lot. Like, a lot of infrastructure had been destroyed simply because, like, the entire continent was at war, pretty much with itself. And so part of this, like, Marshall Plan was economic aid to help, like, European countries, like, rebuild factories and, like, redevelop their economies, because they were hit by, like, things like bomber planes. And so a lot of infrastructure had been destroyed. And so the Marshall Plan gave a lot of aid to help the continent recover. And so that's part of, like, building goodwill with, like, countries, right? Like, the United States was able to, like, extend its influence by giving aid to these countries. So they would be, like, more willing to side with the United States than the USSR when it came to, like, issues of, like, disagreement. And so this strategy of containment and containing communism also justified an arms buildup in the United States, because obviously they would have to use military force to stop the spread of communism. And so that's also part of the reason why US officials supported building nuclear weapons. And so that was also what led to Soviets also developing nuclear weapons. And so we're seeing this like huge buildup of arms and like stockpiling of like weapons happening during this period. And so that's like a pretty big defining feature of the Cold War period. And so, like we said earlier, Jameson, this is a period of containment. So the Vietnam War was considered to be part of the Cold War, and it was a Cold War conflict because the United States was fighting with South Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. And so the important thing to remember here is that the United States didn't end up coming out like successful out of this conflict because the terrain was simply like too difficult to deal with. Like US soldiers were dealing with like monsoons and chemical weapons and booby traps, right? Because like the jungle in Vietnam was like really thick. Oh, so Anika says, why would you need weapons in a Cold War? So the United States needed weapons in the Cold War for like two reasons. The first was because there were a lot of situations where the United States was like fighting like proxy wars, like in Vietnam, right? So US troops were going and fighting with like Vietnamese soldiers. The second reason is simply because of like deterrence, right? So the idea of like mutually assured destruction. So if the United States had a bunch of nuclear weapons, it could use them if the Soviet Union decided to use like its nuclear weapons. So the weapons were sort of like a deterrent. And at the same time, they caused a lot of like anxiety around the world because everyone was like, sort of like, I hope we don't go to nuclear war because that would be really bad for everyone. And so that's why they needed weapons during the Cold War. So, like I just said, like those soldiers were oftentimes like going to different countries, and so in Vietnam, around like 60,000 Americans and 2 million Vietnamese people died in the conflict. And so this was also the first time that the public was getting like daily updates about what was happening, like the situation in the war zone through the radio and the TV. And so because these updates were like for the first time, like pretty much like day to day, right? It led to a lot of protests against the war because Americans were like aware that there were a lot of casualties happening, and they didn't really feel like there was a reason for the United States to be like involved in the conflict because American troops were just like being harmed daily, and it didn't seem like we were winning. Like it actually seemed like America was losing, which was exactly what was happening. And so this is like the reason for the 26th Amendment. And so do any of you guys know what the 26th Amendment is? Just drop. Oh, Romelia asks, why didn't other countries help stop the spread of communism in Vietnam? So there were other like countries like involved in a lot of these like proxy war conflicts. But the thing is, like, because they were proxy wars, they were like mostly about the larger like conflict happening between the ideological conflict happening between like the Soviet Union and the United States. Okay, so the 26th Amendment, like Sava just said, and evidently Googled, is that the voting age would be lowered to 18 years old because a lot of like the people that were like being drafted, like even during World War II, were like students, and so they were like 18 years of age. So a lot of them were like protesting against it. And so that's part of the reason why the voting age was like lowered because like the logic was if you can go and fight and die for your country, shouldn't you get a say in whether or not your country goes to war in the first place? So this was like part of the reason why the voting age was like lowered through the like 26th Amendment. And so students were like really at the forefront of like Vietnam War protests, right? Because like a lot of like even now we see like students like leading charges for like social change. Like right now we see it happening with like the movement for gun control. And so there's, especially the Parkland students were able to like, and climate change, like students have been like really able to like, mobilize and like advocate for change, right? And so that's a parallel we see happening throughout history. Students were really involved in like the Vietnam War protests. And so like they were so involved that the 26th Amendment got passed and ratified. And so the voting age was lowered. So that's potentially something that you guys could like talk about in an FRQ about like social change and how students are like always really involved in it. But yeah, so like we talked about earlier, another one of like the defining features of the Cold War was the fact that it was like a constant arms race. So both Americans and Soviets wanted to like deter attacks by showing that like if either of the countries like did try to move towards war, the other country was more prepared. So it was sort of like this idea of deterrence. And so both countries started like stockpiling weapons. And so like a few of like the key events that happened were in 1949, Soviets tested an atom bomb. And so because of that happening, President Truman in response was like, the United States was going to build an even bigger bomb, like a super bomb. And so Stalin in response like said the exact same thing. So they were like constantly competing. And so in 1952, Americans tested the hydrogen bomb. And so this was like such a destructive bomb that it literally vaporized an island. And so that's exactly what Saba's talking about, right? Like they're hoarding, but like literally with weapons. They're building up these like both countries, the Soviet Union and Americans were like building up these huge stockpiles of weapons, and they weren't really using them in like conflicts if it wasn't like a proxy war. But like they also just like kind of had them, and that was especially the case with like things like nuclear weapons, because like they weren't actually going to deploy them because they were incredibly deadly, as was seen at the end of World War II in Japan. And so that's what led to this idea of mutually assured destruction. Neither country was going to move towards using nuclear weapons because it would mean that the other country would be like the word that I want to use is like not an appropriate one, but it would mean that the other country was in a lot of trouble too. So neither country was going to use their nuclear weapons in the first place. They just kind of had. Yeah, they were not in for a good time if either country like decided to use their nuclear weapons. And so yeah, that's what mutually assured destruction is. It means that like they're both mutually assured to not be happy at the end of the day, because millions of people would die if like either country decided to like release its nuclear weapons on the world. And so this is like, these pictures are pictures from like, one is from the testing that happened of a nuclear weapon, or like of a bomb. But the other one is, it kind of shows the climate of what was happening in this period, because this is like a picture of students, as was like commonplace during this period, of them like kind of like taking shelter from a nuclear weapon attack. And so the thing to remember here is that if a nuclear weapon like goes off, like even like a mile away, hiding under your desk isn't really going to do anything. It's too destructive to actually be helpful, right? But they were still trying to give students like a peace of mind. And so like there was this really big like cultural fear that was happening during this period, because it was sort of like, you don't know if the Soviets and Americans are like actually going to go to war at some point. So that's why they had like drills like this. And so you can also like look up videos from these drills on like YouTube. Like I remember in my APUSH class, like there was one with like a turtle showing little kids in elementary school how to like take shelter. And so it was obviously an animated turtle, but like they had to make these videos to like show kids that they'll be fine. So yeah, but at the exact same time, there was also the space race that was happening. And so like the competition of like Americans and like Soviets trying to beat each other was literally everywhere. It like even extended to like outer space. And so like the competition, like it was real for this entire period of like years. But after the Soviets like launched Sputnik, which was the first man-made object in Earth's orbit, President Eisenhower created NASA. And so it was created like directly as a result to help the United States be more competitive in like developing technology to get Americans to outer space. And so in 1961, like the Soviets were still like winning when it came to the space race because they had like put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. I probably butchered that one. But President Kennedy, because like there was a switch of administrations at that period, he wanted to put the first man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. And so like it wasn't even like known if that was like a completely possible thing to do, right? But in 1969, because like there was so much more funding for like NASA and like so much more of a drive to like beat the Soviets, Neil Armstrong became like the first man to like set foot on the moon. So that is a picture from like that specific expedition. And so yeah, so like the space race became like a way for the Soviets to like compete, right? Because there was the arms race happening, which was like more centered on like direct conflict, right? But like even the space race was indirectly about whether or not like the free market and like democracy would be able to beat out like communist ideologies at the end of the day, right? Like all of this was part of like one big common thread. And so like this whole culture of like fear was kind of like very prevalent, right? Like in the chat, I see you guys talking about like gun violence and school shootings and like how it became like an everyday norm. Well, as part of like the Red Scare, this whole like fear of communism also became like very much like a norm of the time period. And so like so much so like that the House of Representatives created the House Un-American Activities Commission. And so it specifically like was holding hearings to like investigate communism and see if like there were any like communists in America, because they didn't want that to happen, right? And so like this commission specifically accused like a bunch of State Department employees of like being communists. And yeah, Anika, we'll touch on the Vietnam War a little bit more in the end when we talk about proxy wars in more detail. And so this was sort of like a very like big thing that was happening, right? Like hundreds of people in Hollywood were like forced to like say that they weren't communists and that like left-wing beliefs were like evil and like to renounce them, right? And so they were also like forced to testify against each other. Like even though like I'm sure a lot of them were like not communist to begin with, it was sort of like you had to say it, you had to point your finger at other people, so you weren't considered to be as much of a suspect. And so like that's what happens in a lot of crime shows, but it was also what happened in this time period. And so part of the reason why this was happening was because of this whole idea of like McCarthyism. So there was this guy named Senator Joseph McCarthy, and so he was sort of like ramping up the fear against like communism, and like these investigations he was saying were like so important because there were like communists in the American government and they had to like unroot them and expose them so like America and democracy could be safe, right? And so this led to thousands of people being like investigated and prosecuted and fired, because this was. Oh, so Anika asks, what's the differences and similarities between the Red Scares? So the differences between like the two Red Scares, and some of the similarities were that obviously they were both about communism, right? And so it was both about a fear of like communism spreading into the United States. And so like the important thing to remember here is that another one of the like common threads between both Red Scares is that there weren't, in many cases, there were like specific incidences where like these people who were being accused of being communists weren't even really communists. So like the first Red Scare, which happened in like the 1920s, was more about like patriotism, right? Because there were a lot of like unionists and like average working men that were like going on strikes because they wanted like more workers' rights, right? Because like they thought if they unionized and worked together, they were more likely to like get rights from companies, which is like a normal thing, right? Unionization. And so that's where a lot of fear of like Reds like came from. It stemmed more from like social movements and like actual things that were like happening, right? Like Seattle workers going on strike in order to like get more like working rights. The second Red Scare, on the other hand, was more about like those differing ideologies between the Soviets and the United States than like actual things that were happening, right? Like communism wasn't like really flourishing in the United States at that period. It was more of just like a fear that was being perpetrated. And so that was the differences and some of the similarities between first and second Red Scare. Also, they happened in like different time periods. So Jameson says corporations took advantage of the Red Scare in order to basically oppress their workers. So that wasn't exactly what happened in the first Red Scare. It was more like the mobilization of workers came first, and then like the Red Scare happened because people were like afraid of communism spreading. But yeah, it was sort of like a byproduct, right? Because corporations were able to say like, we can't let you unionize because that will help communism. So obviously no one wanted that to happen. But yeah, that was kind of like a byproduct of that. But McCarthyism it happened in like the second Red Scare, right? And so it was so effective that like those that were targeted by like the House Un-American Activities Commission and Joseph McCarthy, they were like blacklisted. And so a lot of them even like left the United States. And so eventually what caused like the second Red Scare to end was that Senator McCarthy, he targeted the United States Army and said that there was like a lot of communism within the army, and a like very trusted news anchor named Edward Murrow. And so he like his credibility kind of declined because like it wasn't really like believed that those two people or like organizations would have a lot of communism in them. So Pearl asks, what about FDR's laws allowing unions? So yeah, unions were like legal. It was just that there was like, when workers were like mobilizing and like protesting for more workers' rights, in some cases in the first Red Scare, it like sort of became like stigmatized. So yeah, that was during like the first, like the New Deal, that like FDR made sure unions were allowed. But yeah, so these are like more visuals for like how there were a lot of propaganda from like Joseph McCarthy and like anti-communists being put out. And so there was like a lot of fear mongering that was happening, right? And so that's like kind of a compelling argument to like convince people to be able to like actually like support something you're saying, like, right, like, you're not a real American if you don't agree with me. And so that's like pretty problematic to say, but it's also like the reality of what like happened during the Red Scares. And so this is kind of more where we're going to talk about the Vietnam War. We'll touch on a little bit more, but proxy wars, they were also a very big like defining part of the Cold War. So proxy wars are pretty much like wars between two countries or like two actors, whether they be like rebellions from a like specific country and like the government, or like two countries themselves that are happening on like of parties aren't like directly involved. So that pretty much means like it's a war that's happening between like two organizations or countries, but it's not really about those two specific actors. It's about like something bigger. So the Vietnam War is an example of like this idea of a proxy war, right? Because even though it was about like the internal turmoil that was happening within Vietnam, right, between like communists and like people advocating for democracy, it was really like in the larger picture, both funded and like more about the United States in the ideological battle that was happening between the US and like the Soviet Union. And so because of that, there's usually a relationship between the people that are like actually in the conflict and like the countries that are not directly participating. And so that's usually things like funding or like arms. So like weapons, they might like give the organization that they support like guns. So is fighting your, yeah, so it's pretty much like fighting your war through like someone else. So like this ideological battle that was happening, it was allowing the US and the USSR to exert their influence without like ever becoming directly involved themselves, right? So like if, for example, like communists won out in Vietnam, it showed that the USSR was like gaining influence throughout the world. Like it was able to like extend its like sphere of influence. And so it also helped that countries that were like providing this like funding and arms and assistance in many cases weren't having to like convince their own citizens to like send troops themselves. They were just saying that they're like supporting democracy overseas and like giving funding to people who are fighting for democracy, right? And so in many cases, that's what like the United States did. They provided like funding and weapons and training in some cases to like organizations around the world that were like fighting for democracy. And so like in the Soviet, in the like Afghan war that happened, the Soviet-Afghan War, that's exactly what was happening. It was fought between Afghanistan rebels who were called like the Mujahideen and the Afghan government. And so the Soviet Union had a long history of providing aid to Afghanistan, right? And so the reason why the war ultimately ended up happening was because there was a coup in 1978. And so there was like a takeover by like the communists pretty much. And so they pretty much like instituted a bunch of like modernization reforms. And so these reforms were largely opposed by like the rural population and like the powers that had been before like the takeover by like the communists. And so the government became like hugely repressive. And so the United States had like supported the rebels that were like trying to prevent this communist government. And on the other side, the Soviets were like supporting like the communist organization that was like trying to institute these modernization reforms. And so the reason why it came to an end was because the war was like costing Soviet troops, which like it wasn't like actually supposed to like hurt the Soviet Union, right? Because it was just supposed to be a way to like extend the USSR's influence. And so that pretty much meant that like even the Soviet-Afghan War, it wasn't ever really about like modernizing Afghanistan. It was really about like the Soviets being able to like extend their influence, right? And so this is also kind of what happened in Cuba. And so the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, he overthrew the president of like Cuba, who was like supported by Americans, whose name was like General Batista. And so the important thing to remember here was that General Batista, he was like a corrupt and oppressive president, but the reason why the United States was supporting him was because he was friendly with US companies. So it's like important to remember, especially when we're looking at things through like a historical context, that the United States hasn't been like on the right side of every single conflict, right? Like it's important to remember that like there's a lot more context to like historical events than what like it may seem like. And so that's why the US government financed the invasion of Cuba by some Cuban exiles who had been like opposed to Fidel Castro. And so it was because they like didn't support his like overthrowing of like General Batista, right? Because General Batista was like friendly to US corporations, so like him being overthrown was like sort of bad for like US companies. And so these so like the thing to remember here is that the Figs invasion was not a successful invasion, like by any means. And so to answer your question, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened in 1961. So like these exiles were badly outnumbered. Like Fidel Castro like had his like entire guerrilla army. And so like that campaign was not successful at all. Like they surrendered in less than a day. And so it was sort of became like an embarrassing moment for the United States, right? Because like this like foreign policy move that they had, it was intended to be successful by all means. And so they had essentially like angered Fidel Castro by like trying to overthrow his regime, and they hadn't been successful at it, which was not good for the United States. And so that's what led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because like this whole failed Bay of Pigs invasion where the United States tried to like overthrow the Cuban government didn't sit well with Cuba. And so when the Soviets like asked Cuba to like allow them to install nuclear armed missiles to threaten the US, Cuba agreed. And so one thing to remember is that Cuba is only 90 miles away from the United States shores. And so this means that it's like incredibly close. And so President Kennedy obviously like wanted to take like direct action to like stop the threat of like nuclear weapons hitting the United States. And so he enacted a naval blockade around Cuba. And so he also like told Americans about what was happening. And so that was sort of like kind of scary, right? Because if you're just like minding your own business and then all of a sudden like your president's like, oh, by the way, 90 miles away from our shores, there are nuclear missiles being like set up to threaten us. Like that's kind of scary. And so for 13 days, there was a standoff between like the Soviet Union and Cuba and the United States. And so the reason why those like missiles ended up being removed was because the US promised not to invade Cuba. And like on the DL, President Kennedy agreed to remove US missiles from Turkey. And so these US missiles were like able to threaten the Soviet Union. So this agreement was like mutually beneficial because there would be no more missiles in Cuba threatening the US, but also no more missiles in Turkey threatening the the Soviet Union. So that is how that was resolved. And so that also like eventually a few years later led to like the Cold War coming to a close. Because as Nixon became president, he decided that he was more focused on using diplomacy than military action. And so he encouraged the UN, the United Nations, which was formed after World War II, to like make sure global peace was happening. to recognize the communist government. And so like he also like went to China to like establish diplomatic relations. And so it's important to remember here that even though he was having like success with his foreign policy, he was also like using that successful foreign policy to kind of distract from like the domestic struggles that he was having in terms of like making sure that his agenda got passed. And so he also like used this period of time to relax tensions with the Soviet Union. So they signed SALT I and limited like arms. And so officially, it took President Reagan becoming president and giving like aid to anti-communist governments and like insurgencies, which are pretty much just like people trying to overthrow the established government all around the world to like end like the Cold War. Because at the exact same time, the Soviet Union was like struggling to like be able to get through its own like economic and political turmoil. So the Soviet Union was falling apart, and like anti-communist governments were like becoming like more effective because of American aid. So like that was like when President Reagan was like, knock this Berlin Wall down, because like the Berlin Wall was like built between East and West Germany and sort of like served as a symbol between like of like communism and democracy and the division that it had caused. And so like during this time period, non-communist governments were like replacing all the communist ones in Eastern Europe. And so the Berlin Wall was like officially knocked down, and it was viewed as the end of the Cold War. So like that was it. And that was like the end of the Cold War. And so because the United States had participated in so much like so many proxy wars around the world, there was the War Powers Act, which was passed in order to like check presidential power to commit like the United States to an armed conflict, right? Because like the president was able to like send troops without ever actually getting like a real declaration of war. So the War Powers Act was passed in order to like check that power. And so it would need like congressional consent for like forces to be like sent out. And so, yeah, that was like after the Cold War had finished. And so if you guys have any questions, now would be a great time to ask them, because this is all the content that I have for y'all. So I'll go over the Bay of Pigs invasion. Oh, like you're actually in spring break. Okay. But yeah, I'll go over the Bay of Pigs invasion while I leave this slide up. But so the Bay of Pigs invasion, pretty much it was where the United States like backed like Cuban exiles. And so these exiles had left because of the fact that Fidel Castro had like taken power with his like guerrilla army, and he had overthrown the American-backed President General Batista with his like army, right? So these exiles were like opposed to his rule, and so the United States like gave them money and helped like their invasion of like Cuba. So that was the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so it was like incredibly ineffective because like it was a very small group of like these Cuban exiles that were going up against like Fidel Castro's guerrilla army. So they were incredibly outnumbered. So they like did not succeed in their invasion of Cuba. Do you have any more specific questions? Didn't the US soldiers use the same strategy the Viet Cong used during the American Revolution? So that was the whole idea of like guerrilla warfare, right? Where you're like, yeah, like hiding in bushes and attacking rather than like lining up on a field and like trying to fight your battle. But the difference between like the American Revolution and like the Viet Cong strategy was kind of, right? Because the US soldiers were not experienced in fighting in like thick jungle underbrush and like trees and stuff like that. So like not only the climate but also the terrain put US soldiers at a huge disadvantage during the Vietnam War. Yeah, in the French and Indian War, like guerrilla warfare has very much become like a more used tactic and like since the American Revolution. Okay, so it seems like no one has any more questions. So thank you everyone for joining me, Perla. I'm doing fine. I hope you guys are too. So stay safe, keep social distancing. I hope you guys have a great, oh, how much of period 8 was covered? I'm not sure what you mean by that too. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining me. But yeah, thanks y'all.